So I'm going to start you off, and I hope this works. So this is the module that we're doing is module 7, and it's fair housing and consumer protection. And I'm just going to pull this chat up a little higher here so I can make sure. If you guys lose me for some strange reason, please put it in the text. So as we're going to talk about, so fair housing, as we're going to see, the dates to remember, when they started, 1866, when this first came into play. We're going to talk about what was one of the protected classes in 1866. And then we're going to go through some terms. And then after that, we are going to talk about what happened in the 60s and how some changes came to play with the Fair Housing Act. But in the meantime, before that, I wanted to say we're celebrating the National Association of Realtors, and many others are celebrating 50 years of the Fair Housing and Consumer Protection Act, which we abide by now. And the National Association of Realtors put out a great video. I'm going to attempt to play this, and then I'm going to try to get on my chat to make sure you can all see it. It worked okay in the test, and I just want to make sure everybody can see it then. It's only about 5 minutes. When you watch this video, I want you to pay attention, because it's people talking about what had gone on, what had transpired to make the changes that happened in the Fair Housing Act. You're going to hear some terms in there. You're going to hear terms like steering, blockbusting. And as we go through these terms in our module, by listening to this, you're going to be able to, I think, get a better sense of what it was all about and how it transpired. So I am going to go to video now, and let's pray after our volume issue that it works. Okay, guys? So we are going to go, again, this is the National Association of Realtors has put out this, I think, pretty amazing video.
On April 11, 1968, the Fair Housing Act was enacted into law, recognizing that property rights should not be abridged because of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, or religion. Resistance, harassment, and violence are unfortunately hallmarks of the pursuit of equal housing in our country. For generations, access to housing of choice didn't mean access for all. Where you lived was often dictated by the color of your skin.
There was a thing known as white flight. If there are 2 or 3 African Americans in a block, then it's time to go. Real estate brokers that were taking full advantage of those fears, of that flight. That's how many of the communities were changing block by block through the course of a summer.
But the population was discriminating. You know, the neighborhood, whenever a person of color came into a neighborhood, people would begin to sell. They panic, you know. It was awful, you know.
In the mid-70s, I was showing a black couple through a home, and I got a phone call from a neighbor who used very offensive language and told me that if I sold that house to that person or that group, that they would do physical harm.
We acknowledge our industries and associations' early opposition to fair housing and recognize those individuals and organizations that helped change our policy. For example, in 1947, African American real estate brokers formed the National Association of Real Estate Brokers with a clear fair housing purpose.
And that certainly started to give me a platform necessary to not only talk with my realtor brothers and sisters, but to work even more diligently within the community which we came from, which was denied opportunities of property ownership.
Many people have given much of their lives to advance the cause of fair housing, often risking more than just their livelihoods. Despite continued opposition across the country, the Fair Housing Act declared a national policy of fair housing by prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. Changing attitudes and behaviors proved to be difficult.
And the community organizations attacked us that first year, breaking our office windows, demonstrating in front of the office, coming into office. There was a network of ladies that were at home that would call and jam our telephones. Stop selling in our neighborhood, click up. Stop blockbusting in our neighborhood, click up, et cetera, et cetera.
Progress has been made. The Fair Housing Act was amended in later years to prohibit discrimination based on gender, disability, and familial status, and to increase enforcement of the law.
So when we looked at it and said, now, wait a minute, this makes good business sense to be a positive person in the real estate market and following the fair housing law, that we should get out there and do something to prove and help our members know that they're doing the right thing.
When I started out, I remember having people that say, well, I want to go to this neighborhood, but I don't want to go to that neighborhood. And it seems like over time, I mean, we're talking 30-something years, I don't get those questions asked. Where I live, everywhere, there's people all sorts of race, creed, color, age. It's a true melting pot.
But many communities remain segregated, and housing discrimination based on race, religion, and more still exists. Only half the country prohibits discrimination in housing against the LGBT community, and HUD reports that the highest proportion of complaints involve discrimination based on disability. Each of us, as realtors, as business leaders, or leaders in our local, state, and national associations, have a role to play in this commemoration. Today, we're leading efforts to expand fair housing protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We must strive, together with our partners, to define how to bring about a market that's truly open and provides equal housing opportunities. We are not alone in commemorating the Fair Housing Anniversary. We are working together with our partners and allies to show that our industry is firmly committed to equal housing opportunities and recognizes the unique and important role each organization and each of us has in this monumental endeavor.
Fair housing has made us stronger in a lot of different ways. One of them is protecting us in all of these areas. Race, religion, familial status, age, everything.
Well, we're just doing the right thing for people, for everybody. So we're doing what's ethical and what's right.
Our Fair Housing Center and the Grand Rapids Association of Realtors works in coordination with each other to make sure that fair housing is absolutely there for all.
How will you participate in commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act? After all,
Fair housing.
Fair housing.
Fair housing
Fair housing makes us stronger.
makes us stronger.
Makes us stronger.
Hi guys, I'm back. Just want to make sure that you can hear me now that I'm back. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to wait a few minutes because I know we're a little behind. And I'm back. And I did a test, so it looks like we're here. So I think that by watching that video, it puts a little perspective into a couple of things. One, fair housing. You saw some brief clips on, the 60s and how things changed. But also, we talked about in another module, we talked about the difference between being a realtor and being just a real estate sales professional. And you see, these are the types of things that the National Association of Realtors do. It's an amazing association, and they are there to, as I said, protect the consumers, protect us, And, I hope you enjoyed that. I had been doing some investigating because I knew it was the 50 year and I wanted to see what was out there. And I saw that video and I really liked it. Glad you enjoyed the video. I loved it. Okay, so now we are going to get into the module, and we are going to talk about some of the things that you saw in that video and what we, what we as realtors can do about it. Why was fair housing put into place? It was put into place because of the basic concepts that people have a choice to live where they want to live if it's in their means. Okay, so they have a choice to live where they want to live if it is in their means. What do we talk about with protected classes? Protected classes includes a membership in a class, perceived membership in a class, an association with a membership of a class. All righty, here we go. Here we go. All right, so see, there's other ways to get around this. You guys are being so patient. Basic concepts. We just discussed the basic concept. People have a choice to live where they want to live if it's within their financial means. All right, so the Fair Housing Act of 1866, remember 1866, that was, the protected class was just race. All right, you're going to see as we go on the changes that transpired and why. When we talk about protected classes, we talk about an individual. What is an individual? That's that one person, the homemaker, the real estate professional. All right, that's the individual. Groups of individuals. We're talking about groups of minors. You can't discriminate against groups of married couples. You can't pick a whole group of people in particular based on religion, race, or any of those other protected classes and discriminate as a whole group. So testers, I think that the video clip showed just a tiny bit of the testers. I'm trying to get my chat up here too. Just a tiny bit of the testing situation. So testers are sent out, and they are sent out to monitor ads. They're sent to our offices to make sure that we're practicing good fair housing practices. We're going to get into a little bit more detail on some of the cases where testers were sent out. Testers are sent out to make sure that people are abiding. They're looking at ads, print ads. They're making phone calls saying that they want to rent an apartment, and they're sending out, African Americans or Asian group or whatever, and then a Caucasian group to see our each group, each protected class being treated the same way. Organizations. So the organizations that deal with fair housing would be HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And in Massachusetts, there's something, and the acronym is MCAD, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into Massachusetts. And that stands for the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And we will be talking about that as well. The complainant. So I think that I have that spelled a little wrong. Know for your vocabulary terms. What is the complainant? The complainant is the person that is filing the complaint, that has the fair housing complaint or discrimination against them. That would be the complainant. And the respondent. The respondent is the person that or business that it's filed against. Property owners. So when we go through this and we're going to talk about property owners, we're going to talk about who they are and what are the different rules. Are they individual property owners? Is it a management company and so forth? So as we go through, we will talk about the difference. Some property owners may be able to say if they're living in the property and they do not want children living, it's a multifamily and they don't want children living next door to them, or there's an elderly family in there that having children in there might be deterrent to that person's health. We'll see how those transpire, but always remember, and I'm going to say this a million times, through this presentation, you can never, whether you are that single owner or not, you can never discriminate against race. So real estate, real estate agents and agencies, we have to abide by the rules. All right. We're going to discuss these concepts and you'll see them on the exam. There'll be questions like, you go take a listing and the seller says, I absolutely do not want to sell my home to anybody, that is in this protected class. And what you're going to say to them, what do you think you're going to say to them? I have to get because I'm doing this slide presentation a little bit differently, so I have to find my chat. What do you guys think that you would say to them? That property owner says, I don't want to sell to this protected class. Give me your thoughts on that. What do you think the correct response would be? Because you will see that on the test. And I'm going to move on because I know that we had a little bit of a delay, but I'm going to come back and look at your chats. Management companies. So management companies also, there are rules that management companies have to follow. We will talk about, because we're breaking this all down. I just want to give you kind of the vocabulary right now. Management companies, what are the rules for management companies? Do they have to follow the same rules as an individual? Do they have to follow, do they have to have the correct forms? So yes, what you're going to see is, and we'll just talk quick about it, is that those management companies are going to have the same leases that they have for every protected class. And when we get into the handicap status and the elderly status, we'll talk about what the rules are as far as how that property management company is going to handle the requests from somebody who is handicapped or elderly or so forth. So as we talked about testing, we did talk about, what they do, what they go out and do. And they're going to come, they could come and they could visit your office. So one of the things that they're going to look for, they're going to look for, they're going to look at your notes. Do you have anything in there that says, seller says don't sell to any African American? Seller says don't, sell to any Asian families. They're going to look at the types of policies that are in your office. They're going to make sure that the proper fair housing and consumer protection signage is in your office. And we'll talk about one of those cases. So one of the things that they're going to look at that you should absolutely pay attention to, this thing called this technique of matching. All right, you let your buyers, you let your consumers do their own homework. All right, so if a client says that they call you up and that it's an Asian family, we'll just say an Asian family, and all they say to you is, we want a 2-bedroom house with a fenced-in yard, and this is how much we can pay, and this is the type of information they give you, and you think, great. And so you know that there is like a large Asian community nearby, and so you start selecting houses that fit their criteria only in that particular neighborhood. Well, what are you doing? We're going to talk about what that term is. All right, we're going to talk about steering in a minute, but they didn't say to you, I want that 2-bedroom with a nice yard and blah, blah, blah in an Asian community. They didn't give you that information. So what you're going to do is you're going to be showing them houses that fit their community, their criteria, in all of the areas that they want to live in. All right, they have to make the choice. So that technique of matching is let them do their homework. When they say they want they want to live in an area that has children, you're not going to go and say and scope out like the bus stop. Oh, are there any children here at this house, near this house that are the same age as theirs? You're going to give them the information, and they are going to go scout out these places themselves, and then they're going to come back and they're going to say, you're going to give them the listings, and they're going to say, no, I don't want that one. Yes, I want to go see this one. So technique of matching is to listen to what they want as far as the house goes, and then you are going to present all of those, and they are going to make the choice to what houses they would like to share. All right, great. So as I told you, because I had to screen share these slides a little bit differently, I have to keep stopping for a minute here and pull my chat back up. But both of you, excellent. Salesperson should not take that kind of listing. Absolutely. That's going to be one of the choices on your test. We're going back to, what does that property owner do? What do you do if that property owner tells you that you don't want to, work with this particular class? They don't want to sell to this particular class. And Kira, yes, salesperson should not take that listing. And then, I'm very sorry that you feel that way. However, as an agent, I cannot discriminate against the buyer. Exactly. And I think one of the test questions that you might see comes up something like, explain the seller. Sometimes people, believe it or not, even in this day and age, people don't realize, your seller may not even realize that he is breaking the law by making that statement to you or not wanting to sell to some protected class. So you as that professional will explain to them, you know what, this is the law, this is the rules in the fair housing. And if they are insistent at that point, Kara, absolutely right. You don't take the listing. Just walk away from it, because it is not worth it. It is not worth it. That sale is not worth it for you. Good answer, guys. Okay, now I have to go back over here to my... All right, so legitimate and not entrapment. So there was a case, let me see if I have that on this slide. No, so there was a case, Havens versus Coleman, excuse me. And I don't think that you need to know the particular case for your test, but this goes to back to what the testers do, and this also gives you a little bit of an idea what's going out, how people are upholding the fair housing rules, how they're trying to enforce, I should say, the fair housing rules. So there was a case, Havens versus Coleman, and there was a nonprofit organization called HOME, and that is Housing Opportunities, Housing Opportunity Organization. Can't remember exactly what it stands for, but they sent testers out to determine whether Havers was practicing racial steering. All right, and we're going to talk about what that steering is. But they sent Coleman, who was a black tester, and he went to an apartment complex, and he was told, "I'm sorry, there's no apartments available." And then they sent a Caucasian tester, and they were like, "Sure, there's plenty of tests, there's plenty of apartments. Do you want a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom, whatever?" And so the courts found that they were, that they were not, that they were breaking the fair housing rules and regulations. So I bring this up only because I want to tell you, these are the types of things that that go on. There were a couple of other videos, but I didn't want this whole thing to be videos where they broke it down, and they had like a mixed race couple go to an apartment complex, and the video shows, the African American man went first, and they said, yes, there's plenty of places. He went and looked at it, and he said, can I come back tomorrow with my girlfriend? He came back the next day with his girlfriend, and they were a mixed race couple. And the agent said, oh, I'm sorry, all the apartments are booked. And he said, what are you talking about? You told me to come back today, blah, blah, blah. Or they had a family with children, come, made the phone call. Oh, yes, we have 3-bedroom apartments available. And then they showed up with their crew of children. And then they were told, oh, I'm sorry that, we just rented out the last one that would accommodate you guys. And then they sent out another couple that wanted a 3-bedroom apartment, but it was a couple. And they said, oh, yeah, we have a couple of them to choose from. So these are the types of things that the testers are going to be dealing with, along with looking at advertising and so forth to make sure there's no discriminatory advertising in there. Familiar status. So we broke down individual, we broke down some of the classifications. Familiar status, you're going to hear a lot about that. What is that? That is that there is somebody under the age of 18 that is going to be living in that property. So when we get into the discussion in a few minutes about discrimination against I'm sorry. I have a student that's going to take her test, and I've been talking her off the ledge all morning. She's going to be fine. And I think she just forgot that I'm on a webinar. I apologize for that. But I'm here for you guys normally. As you can see, I get those text messages. So familiar status, that would be somebody against under the age of 18. So the Federal Rights Act of 1866, as I said, remember that date. That, just checking my chat, that was race only, okay? Prohibited practices. My goodness. This thing. Prohibited practices were that covered everything. That it covered single families, that covered selling property, financing, all houses are covered for race discrimination that started in 1866 and that still carries over to now. All right. Covered houses, the enforcement, the board The board could remove your license. If you're an individual, you can be fined. You'll see in another chapter where they break that down into the fines for you. But if you could be fined, you could lose your license if you're the broker. And there can be unlimited damages. You can file a civil action in appropriate court, and there could be unlimited damages. So now in 1968, I'm going to bring my chat up here again for a minute because I like to ask you guys questions when we get to this part. So in 1968, what was going on in the 60s? All right, does anybody know what happened in 1968 that may have affected our fair housing laws? I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes. And I didn't lose sound. You didn't lose sound. I just want to know if anybody has an answer to that question. In 1968, because you're going to have to remember 1968 for your exam. What was going on in 1968? You guys still with me? Oh yeah, I see you're all on here. I'm going to give you a hint in a minute. All right, so I'm gonna give you that hint. All right. In 1968, Martin Luther King, yes, civil unrest. There you go. It was civil unrest. So what happened? 1968 was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. All right. Within a week of that assassination, and I think that there was a little clip of this in that video that I showed you. Within a week of Martin Luther King's assassination, lots of protests, yes. Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, signed additions to the Fair Housing Act. It was total unrest, exactly. And so after that act, so we had 1866 race. In 1968, we ended up with origin, national origin, race, color, religion. Then in 1974, you don't necessarily need to know that date, we had handicap, mental and physical was added, and familiar status. And then in, the 80s sometime, late 80s, sex was added. All right, so we had race, color, religion, national origin, sex. Oh yeah, sex was added in the 70s. I always say, oh, what was happening in the 70s? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's what people sometimes think, but I think it was the women's movement. We had the women's movement in the 70s. So and it was a very powerful movement. So in the 70s, sex, you couldn't discriminate against sex. Okay, so you see how it's has moved forward since 1866. So we now have race, color, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, mental and physical, familial status. And a good way to remember this is like a little acronym. And I always say it's an acronym, but if you don't know how to spell correctly, but sound out the word, sound out fresh corn. And if you have fresh corn, FRSHCRN, you can, sometimes that will help you remember what these protected classes. So the F, you have familia, the R, race, S, sex, H, handicap. And then for the corn, C, you have color. R, religion, and then N, national origin. So that's kind of a silly way to remember. But somebody said that to me many years ago. I've been doing this for 20 years. And when I first started out, somebody said fresh corn, and I was trying to spell it correctly. And I'm like, that doesn't fit. And then they said, oh no, just sound it out. Anyway, fresh corn, maybe that will help you. So the protected classes, again, we said, and the prohibited practices. The prohibited practices are to refuse to sell or otherwise deny. Okay, we're going to talk more about handicap in a minute and the elderly and children and break it down. But what? So we have all these new protected classes. What are the prohibited practices? Refusal to sell or rent or deny. Discriminations of the sale or the rental. Discrimination in advertising. Okay, an individual, if you are an individual and you have your own property and you're not working with a broker, you still cannot discriminate against race. All right, and we'll break that down a little bit more in a few minutes. But always remember, like I said, I'm going to say this as a broken record. You can never discriminate against race. But discrimination in advertising, you can't say things like, you can't be blatant, obviously. You can't say no children allowed. You can't say things like, oh, you look like you're a good applicant on paper, but I have, did a little bit more research and I found that you had a drug or alcohol problem in the past, or whatever, or that you were dismissed, you left a job because you couldn't handle it because of a mental or physical handicap. So I don't think that you're going to fit in here. But in the advertising, you're not going to put things like, and in your books, you're going to see this list of things that you can say and things that you can't say. I think actually mother-in-law apartment is, you can say that now, but you can't say things like, or you're not supposed to, a short walk to the beach. You can say, short distance to the beach or whatever, short walk to the beach, or beautiful view. You can put things in there like, biking trails around, swimming trails around, that type of stuff. But you have to be very careful when you're you can't say professionals only, seeking professionals only. Because what is that saying? That's saying we want professionals in here, but we don't want any children or single professionals. So you have to be very careful with those advertising ads. This is false denial of availability. This goes back to that testing that we did those testers that we talked about a few minutes ago. And I think you guys can see me. However, my slides just went off. Did your slides just go off? Oh boy. They're back again. So false denial of availability, that was what that tester had said, all right? Sorry, we don't have any availability, when the African American came in with his Caucasian girlfriend after telling them that there was, or having that family come in with children saying, yes, we have 3-bedroom apartments, and then they came in and they said no. So false denial of availability. Blockbusting. All right, here's the little quiz. Can you guys tell me what blockbusting is? I think some of you have probably already had that in the showcase. And I'm going to give you a few minutes. You are going to know this for the test, okay? You definitely need to know this for the test. You're going to need to know blockbusting. You're going to need to know redlining. You're going to need to know steering. You're going to need to know puffing, which I don't have in here, which is not illegal. But they might throw out, while I'm waiting for you guys to type, they might throw out something like, you know, they might give you a scenario, and they might say, is this an example of, and they'll have all of them in there. Is this an example of blockbusting? Is this an example of redlining? Is this an example of steering? And then you have to make that choice. So blockbusting. Anybody? This is when they say, so if you remember that video that I showed you at the beginning, when realtors force a seller to sell because some class is coming in the area. Exactly, Hera. Encouraging people to move. Yes, Beth, encouraging people to move. But the key part of that is encouraging people to move. Why? And then I think that Kara hit that. It's encouraging people to move because a protected class, another protected class might be coming into the area. So we saw a little bit about that on that video, and we saw that it said, you know, the gentleman that was sitting on the chair had said, you know, that they were doing this. This was very prevalent in the 60s. And they would say, okay, they went into this neighborhood, the suburban neighborhood that's mostly Caucasians or mostly Italian or mostly Irish or whatever. And they would say to them, coercing a seller due to another type of race moving in. Exactly. And they were saying, listen, you know, the guy down the street just sold to an African American or an Asian, you know, person or whatever. And, you know, this is going to be the trend. So you guys need to sell your house quickly, because if you don't, you know, your house is going to be devalued because of this. That is blockbusting. It is illegal. All right. Know that for the test. Redlining. How I want you guys to remember redlining. Redlining has to do with the finance end of things. Okay. Financing. So you have, back in the day, if you look at a lot of our cities were split up until, you know, not that long ago. Now the city is starting to, you know, all the areas are starting to have a good mix in them. However, when a lot of these cities were started, lenders would actually sit there with a map and a red pen. That's where the redlining comes from. And they would split up the city. And they would say, okay, in this part, you know, above this red line, we are only going to be selling, lending money to the Irish that are coming over. In this area, we're only going to be selling to the Italians. In this area, we're only going to be selling to Catholics. In this area, to Jewish people. All right. And so, interestingly, because of that redlining, that's why in a lot of the cities, you know, in Boston, they say, oh, you have the north end, you have, you know, that's the Italian section. You have the south end, that's the Irish section. All of that happened because back in the day, when people were coming here, these lenders got that red pen out. Redlining, that has to do with financing, not on our end. And that has to do with saying that they are only going to be lending money to people of a particular race or religion in certain areas. Now, a lot of those areas, if you go to the north end of Boston or the south end of Boston, there's a lot of college kids there now. It's a big mix. But that's how those sellers, that's how those cities kind of got laid out the way they did. Steering. We already talked about this, and I think that you guys answered this. But what I want you to know about steering is you may not even know that you're doing it. Take that example where I said it was an Asian family and you wanted to bring them to, this Asian neighbor or this Asian neighborhood. You may be, it could be a Jewish couple comes to you and you think, oh, I'm going to bring this to this area of town because they just built this beautiful synagogue and, they have this or they have that. And I think that they're going to be really happy there. All right. You may be doing it because you think that you're doing them a favor, but go back to that matching technique that I talked about a few minutes ago. What are you going to match them on? When they come, you are matching them on what they want. They want, the 3-bedroom house with a yard, with a full basement, with a garage. You are not going to be steering them somewhere where you feel they will want to live. All right? Don't do it. It's illegal. So an appraisal report, let me go back to my chat here for a minute. Everybody's good. Appraisal report with value impact of any of the above. So basically what this is saying is that an appraiser can't devalue a property because of a protected class, a group or a protected class that might be in the area. That is not devaluing the property. That appraiser has to go, and that appraiser has to do all the things that an appraiser does. Look at the condition of the property. Look at, is the paint peeling? Are the fixtures and the appliances and the heating system up to date? How is the roof and so forth? Cannot say, oh, this is in, an African-American community, or this is all Caucasians in this community or whatever. Cannot devalue because of any of the protected class above. Making notations about discriminations. So this is kind of an interesting thing. Remember we talked about those testers coming in. So that making notations about what your seller said. You do not want to make those notations, even if you're not going to take the listing, or you take the listing and you have a notation in your notes that say, this seller does not want to sell to an African-American couple, or does not want to sell to an Asian family. And, I've advised him that I can't do that. I'm going to present all offers, and you put notations of that. Because if anything happens, say offers come in, and the offers are coming in at first blindly, right? They're coming in, in many cases, you might not know the race or the nationality. So they're coming to the seller, you're presenting the offers, and that seller decides for whatever reason he's taking this one, and it happens to be a Caucasian family. Well, if that African-American family was a little bit higher, or sometimes they just get so discouraged in an inventory like it is right now, where there's not a lot of inventory and people are being outbid and outbid and outbid, somebody might want to come and take a look. Somebody might file a complaint and say, I think that I didn't get that house because I'm Asian or because I'm African-American. And somebody, a tester or somebody from HUD, will come and look at your notes. And even though that was not, you told them you were presenting all offers and blah, 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 blah. If you have things like that in your notes, that could appear that you were going along with the seller. So you have to make sure that when you're taking notes and taking notations, that you are not making any, this seller, this landlord doesn't want children here, whatever. So you have to make sure in your notations as well on your paperwork that you're abiding. No coercion, intimidation, interference. This pretty much is, just checking my chat coercing a seller to do another type. Okay, that was for steering. So coercion, intimidation, interference. This is just that you can't, this goes back to the heart of what the fair housing is about. People have a choice to live where they want to live within their means. Okay, so they have to make sure that there is no coercion, meaning that they really want to live in this place, that there's no interference, meaning that discrimination, I'm not showing it to them because they're of this particular race or they have children or whatever. So coercion, intimidation, interference, you have to make sure that you are not involved in it. And if your seller, your landlord, is trying to use any of these intimidation avenues, then you have to be ready to explain the law to them. All right, relative to handicap, and I am looking at my chat here, but I'm also moving along because we had that little bit of a snafu earlier on. But please, if you have any questions, looks like you're all doing good. If you have any questions, please jump in. So relative to handicap, refusal to make reasonable accommodations and policies. Now this goes to businesses, refusal to make reasonable accommodations and policies. For example, it would be a business that everybody in the office was mandatory, because they felt that it kept production up. Everybody had to go out, at lunchtime and take 15-minute breaks walking around the building, or, doing some yoga and stretches in the office. I mean, it sounds silly, but there are offices that do this. Okay, you have to have a break. But okay, what if you have somebody that's in a wheelchair? What if you have somebody that can't walk? You cannot make it mandatory in a policy to go out and do those type of things that may be discriminatory to somebody. And also, so you have to make those reasonable accommodations in the policy. If you are able to. If not, if you're in the wheelchair, we'd like you to do, these kind of exercises, or, step away from your, step away. That was bad wordage. Move away from your workspace and, do whatever. But you have to make sure that you have the reasonable accommodations in your policies. Refusal to permit reasonable modifications in existing premises. So this comes up a lot. The tenant can make those reasonable modifications in that property to make it handicap accessible. The landlord can't interfere with that. And when we say reasonable, we don't mean gut the whole place, but they can make reasonable accommodations. And they have to, when they move out, they have to put the property back again, to the state that it was. Failure to design and construct new covered multifamilies. On and about mid-90s, I believe it was, there were rules that took place that you had to make reasonable accommodations. If you had an apartment building, you had to make sure that there was either an elevator or that there were garden floor apartments. Now you can't not rent. So you have these garden apartments that a handicapped person could come into and so forth. You're abiding by the rules. You don't have to keep those vacant because no handicapped person has come. You can rent to somebody else, but you have to make sure that those buildings are handicap accessible. I think it was after 1991. All right. So that rule was designed for multifamily dwellings, and the property covered a residential property, not commercial. Any type of residential property, if it's handled by a real estate broker, and it, depending on the type of property and depending on the type of discrimination, the broker may have liabilities. No discriminatory advertising. Okay, you cannot have individual, even an individual is going to be, we remembered race, right? But even an individual cannot say no handicapped people allowed. All right, no discriminatory advertising. No written notice or statement. And that goes back to your advertising that says that you, sorry. So that goes back to your, short walk to the beach, great view of the water, and so forth. So single family homes, privately owned with a broker handling the transaction. All right. The broker, as I said, can be liable if the broker is doing the discrimination, even if it's on behalf of that landlord. All right. Privately owned with discriminatory advertising. We're still talking about a single family here. No discriminatory advertising. This can also be, what this could have to do with any of the above, familial status. It could have to do with race and so forth. Right now, we're talking about handicap. All right, we are not going to discriminate against the handicap because we do not want them making modifications in our home. It's not allowed. Privately owned with more than one house sold in 2 years. All right, so if it's privately owned property and you've had more than one house sold in 2 years, you're not going to be looked at as an individual anymore. You are going to be looked at more of an investor. All right, so the rules are going to be a little bit different than if you were just that individual. Privately owned with more than one house sold in 2 years. Privately owned with more than 3 houses in 2 years, you are considered a dealer. All right, no exclusions, especially in advertising, especially in showing the property. Not privately owned for corporate bank owned. This also could be clubs or religious organizations. There are religious organizations that own property, and they can say that this property that we own, we are only going to rent to people that belong to our congregation. Okay, they can do that. If it is a club, men's club, women's club, this type of club. If it is a private club where they have membership dues, they can ask, excuse me, they can restrict to who they rent, whether they be handicapped, whether, it's race, whether it's sex, and so forth. The clubs and religious organizations can. So when we talk about multifamilies, any 5 or more unit building has to abide by all of the rules. okay? Meaning you can't say, and this is non-owner, any 5 or more unit building. You can't say, excuse me, you know, this building is only going to have professional people in it, no children, so forth, okay? Any 5 or more unit building. 2 to 4 unit, non-owner occupied, they have to abide by all of the things that we just talked about a few minutes ago. 2 to 4 unit owner occupied. If it is a 2 to 4 unit occupied, the liability there would be just to the broker. All right. So if it is an individual with 2 to 4 units and it is owner occupied, if they are renting this property on their own without the use of the broker, they can have a little bit more choice in who they are renting to. Okay. But they still cannot have any discriminatory advertising. They cannot have discrimination against race. They can, because they live in that building, say, excuse me, I can't have small children living in the apartment above me because I work nights and, you know, that just isn't going to work out. They can do that. But they can still not do any discriminatory advertising. They have to deal with that as the people call to book the apartment. Just going to go down here and look for the chat. Everybody doing good? I think so, because you're all still with me. All right, so covered multifamily dwellings for design, construction standards, and handicap discrimination. So this is, I touched on it briefly. I'm going to break it down for you a little bit more. Buildings of 4 or more units have to have an elevator. If they don't have an elevator, they have to have those ground floor units that are handicap accessible. However, they don't have to be fair for them, they don't have to hold those vacant just waiting for a handicapped person to come. All right, housing that's not covered. Sale of a single family, excuse me. Sale of a single family home by a private individual. All right. This is without a broker. They still cannot have any discriminatory advertising. They have not had more than one house sold in 2 years, because then they're an investor, right? So the rental of an owner-occupied 2 to 4 family, not covered for owner, they're covered for broker. And what that basically means is if it is a 2 to 4 family, we discussed that a minute ago, they have a little bit more discretion on who they can, because it's an owner-occupied. So I know I'm repeating that, but I just want you guys to understand the difference between an investor that has a multifamily home that doesn't live there, an investor that has a multifamily home, but he does live in there. The rules are a little bit different, because remember when we were talking about at the beginning, we broke it down to individuals, groups of individuals, or whatever. That individual homeowner that's owner occupied has a little bit more flexibility on who he has living in the property. Religious organizations, we already talked about that. You know, they can have say that their congregation, only people in their congregation are going to be living in their apartments. Private club, the same thing. They pay dues. They can be restrictive, men's clubs, women's clubs. But if a licensee is involved, a broker is involved in that like religious group or that private club and doing the advertising or the promoting and so forth for them, then they still have to abide by those rules. Okay, that broker has to abide by those rules, or that broker is going to be in some trouble. He could face some fines. All right, now we get into, and I hope I'm not going too fast for you guys. Like I said, we got off to a crazy start. Housing for older persons. So when we talk about familial status, we say that you can't discriminate against children coming in, correct? Except if it's housing for older persons. That familial status can be set as 55 and older, no children. Age is not protected anyway, but familial status is. But if that whole complex is a 55, you'll see this oftentimes. There's a lot of communities, they're mobile home communities, some smaller condominiums, different communities, small communities that are 55 or older. You can say no children. So the enforcement of the 1968 Fair Housing. The first thing that you would do, you would be filing a complaint with HUD. There is no charge to file the complaint. So that complainant wants to file that complaint. There is no charge to that complainant to file the complaint. All right. United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. They're part of their office that handles it. I mean, basically for the test, no HUD, but they're part of their office that handles it is Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, I believe. So they're one of the United States' largest civil rights agencies. And that is why most of these complaints are going to be handled eventually through them. Now, you can file a civil action in district court. The respondent, HUD has 10 days to respond. Then the respondent has 10 days to respond. So you file a complaint. HUD has to at least acknowledge you, saying that they're starting the investigation within 10 days. The respondent who is being filed against has to respond within 10 days. Doesn't mean it has to be settled within 10 days, but they have to respond and say, okay, I see that there's a complaint against me. I'm getting my paperwork together, and they have to start the process. All right. Sorry, I thought I had the dollar amounts on this slide. So after that 10 days, depending on what HUD finds, the administrative process you can file a civil complaint even after you get your award from HUD, and that can be $16,000 to $65,000. I think that's current in your books because they just upped that amount. That can be $16,000 to $65,000, depending on if they call you like a frequent flyer. If you do this a lot, depending on what the infraction is, that's how they'll determine what your fine is. All right, so we're going to dig into Massachusetts a little bit more. Thanks for hanging in with me, guys. We don't have a lot more to go, but I want to break it down into Massachusetts. And the thing that I want you to pay attention to in Massachusetts are the protected classes. All right, so we talked about the protected classes, and you can write these down. I know that they're in your books, but just remember, and when you hear these, you're going to see that there's some additions. So the protected classes in Massachusetts are race, color, religion, national origin, ancestry, sex, age. So you see age, it's not just familial status. Age is in there. Marital status, veteran status, veteran history or military status. And then they break it down to, along with handicap, they also include, make sure that they include separately blindness, hearing impaired, sexual orientation. Okay, so those are some additions. So we saw that it changed from the 1800s to 1968. There were protected classes added. Massachusetts adds their own. We have the veteran. We have the sexual orientation. They added to just include in the handicap and physical blindness. They added blindness and hearing impaired, sex, and the age. You see that it's not just familial status, it is age. 70,000. Somebody said 70,000, they think. I've got to, maybe you may be right. I knew that it went up. I thought it was 65, but they may, you guys have the new books and it may have gone out again. Double check that in your books. That was just that civil, the civil penalties fines. Somebody just said they think that it went up to 70,000, and you may be correct. Thank you for that. All right, so know those differences in the protected classes when you are dealing with that Massachusetts test. Excuse me. Prohibited practices. The prohibited practices are the same that were covered above. All right. Those are your prohibited practices against race, against advertising, against not letting the handicapped make adjustments to the property. All of those things that we discussed about before are also included in Massachusetts. We just have more protected classes. Covered property is most residential property, commercial space. Commercial space is only on, excuse me, I apologize, basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, age, ancestry, handicap, marital status. Okay, all of those are in commercial space. And when I was the slide before and I said residential property, most residential property. Remember, again in Massachusetts, if you are a owner occupied, or if it's a single family home and you're selling it without a broker, you still cannot discriminate against race, but you still have some of those protections that we saw in the general. All right, so the major exceptions would be lease of that owner occupied two family. All right, we talked about that. That lease of that owner occupied two family is going to be able to say, I don't want children living next door to me, or, whatever, he's going to have more say in who lives next to them. Elderly or state funding. Okay, so if it's an elderly or state funded federally state or federally funded property, they can have some say on who lives there. For example, you have that elderly state federally funded complex. They can say that we're not going to allow children in there. Elderly retirement. So elderly retirement is a little bit different than that small complex that has, you know, an elderly state funded. All right. If it is an actual elderly retirement, they have to have, it's usually about 10 acres, 55 years or older, and all classes, excuse me, except age are protected. Okay, so age is not protected in there because it is a designated elderly retirement. Category 2, I'm just trying to get to my chat here, guys. Okay. Category 2 would be protected classes, would be somebody that's on public assistance or rental assistance. The prohibited practices, this is to prohibit not only the rental or the sale, but to discriminate in furnishing credit services or rental accommodations. All right, it is, you know, pretty much, you know, bottom line is just because somebody is on some kind of federal rental subsidy, you cannot discriminate against them. Now, the interesting thing with this is, you know, we have Section 8. I had multifamily homes, and I would have people call and say, do you take Section 8? And I say, no, I don't take Section 8, but that is because my property has not been approved yet. I would have loved to have accepted Section 8. One of my buildings, it took forever to get the state has to come, they have to inspect it, they have to approve you. It's a whole scenario that the landlord has to do to get approved for that Section 8, that property is approved for Section 8. And sometimes it's very long and time consuming. If you are trying to get this done and the state has just not cooperated as far as time wise, if somebody calls and says, do you take Section 8? You can say, I don't, I apologize. It's just that, you know, my property has not been accepted. Not only the time constraint, but for some reason they have guidelines that they have to follow. If they're going to be helping people move into these properties, they go and they inspect it, and it has to be up to a particular standard. If it is not up to that particular standard, they may not let you, you know, rent to federal or state rental subsidized. No discriminatory advertising, of course, same thing. You cannot say, you know, in your ad, we do not take Section 8. If your property doesn't qualify, you can, you know, you put your ad in, people will call you, they will say, do you accept Section 8? And you say, you know, I do or I don't at this time, waiting for state approval. So the exemptions, pretty much they're really for that rental policy. There's not a lot of exemptions. The exemptions would be for that owner-occupied two-family property. Category 3, which they say in Massachusetts, is children. The prohibited practices, again, same thing. I know I sound like a broken record, but you just got to kind of embed these things in there. Refusal to rent, sell, or otherwise deny because somebody has children. All right. Discrimination in terms and conditions. You cannot say, okay, you can come with your kids. However, you have to, you have to pay $1,000 more in a rental income or in a security deposit, or you have to pay $50 more in rent because you have children. And this is going to bring me to something interesting because I don't think we have a slide to it. But I want you guys to be aware when I teach these classes in class, I always have, I shouldn't say always, I oftentimes have investors that are coming to take the course and they already have multifamilies and they rent. And I tell them, I go through all these rules and regulations and their eyes are bugging out. And I tell them they can't take extra security deposit for children. And I also tell them they can't take extra security deposits for pets. And you can't. And the other thing is you can't discriminate. This has become a really big issue. It's become a big issue in hotels, like guests that are coming. It's become a big issue in rental families, comfort. So everybody, when you say a service animal, everybody pretty much thinks usually like a seeing eye dog or whatever. But we're running into comfort and emotional support animals along with, as part of that service animal. And it's kind of a fine line because if somebody comes and they say that they have, a pig, and that's their comfort animal, because a comfort or emotional support animal can be anything. It's hard to deny them. It's also the other thing that's hard. You can say, I need to have some kind of documentation, from your doctor that says that this is your emotional support or whatever. Now, because of our HIPAA rules, sometimes it's difficult to get that information. You can ask. If they're saying that they have a comfort animal, you can ask. This is really a true story, and why I know this comfort and emotional support animal thing is coming up. In the area where I live, we have a pretty nice hotel, and it has a function room, and it's on the water and so forth. And I happen to know one of the managers there. They actually had somebody come, and they allow dogs actually, and I think they allow cats. It's a pet friendly, but up to like certain pounds or certain amount. They had somebody come, and I'm not even kidding you, I just heard the story like a week ago, with a little donkey, like a miniature donkey. I don't know if that's what they're really called. And the woman at the checkout in was like, sorry, you can't bring your animal in here. And the woman said, this is my emotional support animal. And she had no idea what to do. They had no idea what to do. They did eventually let her go in and, gave her, one of the rooms where they normally allow dogs and so forth. But it was just interesting because I know I've been hearing a lot of situations from landlords and so forth with this emotional support, even though they don't accept pets, and it's going to be something this is kind of going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but it's going to be something when you guys are dealing with this to watch out for, because it's definitely an up and coming thing. But discrimination against terms and conditions, remember, we're in category 3. You don't need to know, like on the test, they're not going to say, okay, what's category 3? All right, that's children. You won't have to know the category, but they break it down like this for you, I think, in your book and some of your study guides. So because each category will have a couple of little differences in there. No discriminatory advertising. This is a no-brainer. It's like in all of them. You cannot discriminate against saying no children. You can't say, as I mentioned above, there's little things that we get into that you don't really think about when the landlord says, oh, this is a professional building. We have a lot of professionals in here, blah, 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 blah. You can't put that professional building, professional couples only. First of all, professional couples or professional people only, that is in a way eliminating, even though you might be a professional person with children, that could still be seen as discriminating against children. Or you could say something like, great for, professional couple, or professional, I don't even know. I don't use these discriminatory things, so I can't even think of how I would word it. But, you cannot put words in there, and you cannot say that you're discriminating, that you're not going to allow children unless it is that protected class 1, the elderly, and it is truly an elderly situation. Okay, so of course now we get into exceptions again. Now we're dealing with children. If you have a 3-family or less that has elderly in there, you do not have to rent to children if you can prove that it would be a hardship to the elderly person that lives there. Okay? If you can prove that it would be a hardship for the person that lives there. So this is Massachusetts rules. We're dealing with category 3 children, protected class, 3-family or less with an elderly in there. You can say it can be a hardship. If it's an owner occupied, we talked about this is the same as general, or a temporary lease, then you can say, this is an owner occupied property and I'm not going to have, I can't have children living next door to me. Lease of an owner occupied 2-family, that is. But remember, you still cannot do any advertising against race, and you cannot say, I'm not going to take children. Take all the applications. You can pick who you want. If you choose not to pick the one that has a child, it is within your rights to do that. Enforcements or remedies. So in Massachusetts, we talked about HUD, right? So HUD is sort of like encompasses all of the rules and guidelines. And that's where a lot of complainants will file. In Massachusetts, we also have, after the overall HUD, we have the acronym as MCAD, that stands for Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. They cover lenders, they cover, like somebody getting a mortgage, rentals. Now, we talked about that 10-day scenario with HUD. Now, it's a little bit different with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. They have up to 300 days to complete their investigation. The complainant has 12 months, 1 year, after the discrimination took place. So if you were a tenant and you were discriminated, or you were you felt that you did not get the property because of your race, you had children, whatever, you have, you don't think about it, and then you start thinking about it because there are not a lot of apartments, and then you think, I wonder if this was the case. You have up to 1 year to file a complaint. Mass Commission Against Discrimination has up to 300 days to complete the investigation. The civil action, so we go to the amounts, and the amounts for the civil offense would be $10,000 for your first offense. It would be $25,000 for the second offense, and up to $50,000 if you've had more than 2 offenses in a 7-year period. Broker and licensing enforcement. So our board is the, those complaints could go to HUD, but or to this Mass Commission Against Discrimination. And if you are found guilty, you can be suspended for a minimum, this is in Massachusetts, a minimum of 60 days. The second is a minimum of 90 days. Okay, so those are the rules against the, keep looking down at my chat, against the broker or salesperson, licensing enforcement. 60 days minimum, up to 90 days, or minimum 90 days after the second offense. All right, Mass General Law 90, Chapter 93. Now, I have so many people, even the person that's going today, that says, do I have to know? You'll see on here and in your book, Mass General Law, and you'll have all these numbers next to it and stuff. You don't need to know all of those numbers for the test. You have to know what they are enforcing, what those rules are enforcing. You have to know what blockbusting is. You have to know those things. The one thing, when you see Mass General Law, Chapter 93, know that this is consumer protection, not fair housing. You might see a test question like that. It might see, on your Massachusetts. Mass General Law 93A is part of the Fair Housing Act. It's part of the Consumer Protection Act. And what this does is it protects ordinary people and defends them from unfair or misleading business practices. Okay, so 93A, business practices, it's consumer protection. That's what I want you to remember. The prohibited practices would be, sorry, I moved on to the slide, would be people advertising the wrong price, putting a price in the paper for a vehicle you call, oh, I like that vehicle, and is it still on the lot? Yes, it is. Great. And they come down there and they say, oh, they bring you in, you love it, and you drive it around, and they say, oh, wait a minute, did I say that car was $10,000? No, I'm sorry, it's $11,000. So misleading advertising, misleading for financing, misleading advertising in their rates. It could be it could be somebody doing a bait and switch, and this actually happened to us, to my husband and I. And I was so aggravated, I wanted to turn them in. So my husband does a lot of travel in his car for his work, and he had a big business trip coming up, and he had to travel, and he was having a lot of issues with his car. So I had been doing some searching. He was not going to get a new car. He was going to get, hopefully a good used car because of all the miles he puts on it and so forth. You don't need to know all that. The main thing is I found a vehicle. It was perfect. It was just what he wanted. It was the same model that he had had for 6 years, or the same type, except for newer. It had all the features in it. And remember, this is somebody who spends a lot of hours, in his car. So some of those features were important to him. So he was driving, takes him about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half to get from work. I met him at the dealership. The dealership was going to close like in a couple of hours. I got there first, and I said, oh yeah, I called, I'm here, see this card, and they bring it out, and I start looking at it, and I'm like, well, it kind of looks like it's the same car. And then I open the doors, and I start noticing it didn't have half of the things that the listing said. The interior was not even the picture of the interior, and I'm like, so can you bring the car I called about out? Oh, this is the car. And I look how they have those little numbers. I'm like, this is not what was in the picture. This is not what we discussed about. And he's like, well, no, I don't know, what the problem is with the ad or whatever, but this is the car. I'm like, but we spoke. I said, it has leather seats. Yes, these have cloth. It has this, it has that. Anyways, bottom line is my husband comes and I'm aggravated. I said, let's just go. He's like, no, I need to get a car. I need it tonight. I'm never going to make it. I said, rent a car because these people are doing a bait and switch. So he drove the car and he's like, you know what? For all the miles I put on it, it's fine. I would not have done that because I knew that was a bait and switch. They put this other vehicle in there. They knew that they got me down there, and they knew that they'd probably be able to sell me, if not that one, another one. This is what 93A consumer protection. I wanted so bad to file a complaint, and I just, he convinced me not to. But every time I go through this module, I think, but that's what they're there for. I did let people all over Facebook and my social media know, but this is what that 93A is there for, consumer protection in the business. Enforcement, they send a demand letter, they file a demand letter, and if it's less than $7,000, it can go, if the damages are less than $7,000, it can go to a small claims. If not, it would go through a proceeding. So we kind of are just getting to the end of this. And we're going to hit some of these. Let me see. See, you guys are all still here. Fantastic. Practical applications and trends. So handling problem situations. You might say, what the heck is this doing in fair housing or whatever? It's in here because a lot of these problem situations may occur. You, the new salesperson out in the field, you have that seller who wants to do these discriminating practices. You're doing blind ads. You're doing, you are not handling yourself in the way you should in regard to fair housing. But the handling of problem situations is you go to your broker. If you have a problem with the seller or with the buyer or whoever it is, you are going to go to your broker. All right. The broker is responsible for you, responsible for your actions. So even if you do something and you're not intending to do it and you're breaking some of the rules, that's going to fall on the broker. So if you are getting into any of these kinds of issues, go with your broker. They are going to have more experience. They are going to be able to guide you on what to do. All right. Responsibilities, other problem situations, how to avoid them, responsibilities as far as steering and this and that. The main thing is you want to be the source of the source. All right. You want to not tell them this is a great neighborhood with great schools and this and that, because your idea of that is different than theirs. Have them go do that investigating on their own. All right. Have them go doing their investigating on their own. And we're going to quickly go through additional consumer protection, because you do have these in another unit. Lead paint law. We have a property transfer notification form in Massachusetts. This is given out. The seller signs it if he knows there's lead paint, or unknown if he has any documentation. You go in your showcase and in your book, you can see that form and you can go through it. Seller signs it, buyer signs it, both agents sign it, along with the form that they sign. There is a pamphlet on that form. It will say to the buyer, were you given by your agent the lead paint pamphlet? And, of course, they're going to say yes, because you're going to do it. It's attached right to that form. It's a pamphlet that gives them everything that they need to know about lead paint. All right. So they're going to sign that property transfer notification. Seller's going to sign it. Agents are going to sign it. But you, as the buyer's agent, are going to give them that document, that packet that explains those rules. UFI. So this was a type of insulation that was used, and it was found that the gases in there were harmful to your health. Then it was found that the gases in there dissipate after a period of time. So oftentimes we would say, do you know, was there ever any UFI insulation in this house? And the seller would say, I have no idea. They don't use it anymore. We don't have to ask them, but I always ask them, because some lenders still on their forms want to know if there was any UFI insulation used in the property. Smoke detectors for the exam. Who gives that smoke certificate out? You are not going to close on a property unless you bring that original smoke certificate to the closing table. Your local fire department in Massachusetts is where you would go. Seems like a no-brainer, but they'll put, state something, whatever, fire division. Just know that it's your local fire department. And just, kind of a quick FYI, because I know we're getting down into close to our time here. When you get that listing, oftentimes what I do is you have the general rules on where they're supposed to be, how many feet outside of a bedroom, where the carbons are, if there's a finished basement, where the carbons are. But especially when you're starting out, what I like to do is I like to just go to the local fire department. Sometimes I do a brief little diagram and sketch of the stairways of the bedrooms of this and that, because they're the ones that are going to come and give you that certificate. And I'm going to say, this is where the smoke detectors are. Is that okay? This is a photo. This is an iodized, whatever type of smoke detector. You want to have photos near the kitchen and bathroom so that steam or just kitchen smoke doesn't set them off. But go to your local fire department. They will look at it and they'll say yes or no, I want one at this stairway, or this should be moved over here. That way you don't have the fire department come. It's hard to get the appointments. You have to book them a couple weeks in advance, and you won't have to have them come back again. As I said, there is going to be no closing without that smoke certificate. Hazardous waste. Oh, thought I lost you guys for a minute. Hazardous waste. Massachusetts has a stringent, comprehensive, I guess is the word, guidelines on hazardous waste. What you should know is that you cannot have somebody, like if you have a painter come to your house, you can't have them, just any painter anymore, come to your house. If the house has lead paint on it, back in the day, they used to just scrape it all off. I mean, not that many years ago. And they, clean it up and toss it somewhere. Now, if there's lead paint on that house, it has to be by a licensed a painter who has gone through a lead removal and disposal course. They have to be certified. Underground storage tanks. You ask, do you know, is it known if your property has had an underground storage tank? And if they say yes, do you know how it was disposed of? They have to be either moved out or they have to be filled and dealt with properly. Again, this is not your job to tell them what to do. If they say, yeah, we had an underground storage tank years ago, then you direct them to the specialist that's going to come and investigate and make sure everything is okay with that. The disclosure and the removal. Asbestos, again, now this you can go into these properties and you'll go in and you'll see like the asbestos wrapped around the piping. Sometimes it's wrapped around the whole furnace. It could be shingles on asbestos shingles, which are great insulators. I just tell people, if there's asbestos on shingles on your house and you're not, and they're not cracked or whatever, I tell them to leave it on. People get, freaked out about it. Oh, asbestos. Cover them up if you want. Like, go over them. You paint them. Go over them with another type of siding. But if you are going to have those asbestos shingles removed, they have to be removed by a contractor. The removal and the demolition and everything have to be, again, by a contractor who is licensed for the removal of the asbestos. Do not have your sellers just go rip the asbestos off the pipes. Back in the day, that's what we used to do. And it's a big deal now. We had lead paint. My house was, we had probably lead paint too, but asbestos in our finished basement wrapped around all the pipes. And my husband was like, no, the kids are going to be down there. And I have a personal experience as somebody who had cancer from the asbestos scarring. So I was a little nervous, but I had no idea what the whole process is. They come, the state, an agency comes and they seal off the basement so that none of the fibers from the asbestos can go anywhere else in the house. And then they remove it and they dispose of it properly, and then they run these fans down there that for days that are supposed to, and they have the big white suits that are supposed to make sure that there are no more particles in the air, and then they come and they do the testing, and when it says 0 particles, now you're free to go down there. It's a big process, but pretty much for you, just know that Massachusetts wants the removal and the disposal done by a licensed professional. All right, agency, down to the last one, agency disclosure. So we have a great module. We have a great showcase, tells you how to fill out the agency disclosure. It talks about what is on that agency disclosure. When do we give them that agency disclosure? And I know we're running late, so I'm not going to ask you guys any more questions, but I'm just going to tell you. Is these on the seller's disclosure form? I'm sorry, I just saw that. So I'm going to leave my chat up. Are these on the, because I don't know, because we have a little bit of a delay, I'm so sorry. Are these on the seller's disclosure form? So the seller's disclosure form is not a mandatory form. That form will be, is where you would go through with that seller and say, has there ever been any work done on the house? Was there a permit? Has there ever been any water in the basement? Has there ever been any plumbing damage? Electrical problems. You go through the whole list. It breaks down all of the list. They say yes, no, unknown. Yes, there was work done. Was a permit completed? You put the date of the permit. That's a seller disclosure form. So I'm trying to think back to what I was talking about. The lead paint is maybe that's where we were going, and I'm sorry if that's not where you were, you can let me know. The lead paint form is a property transfer notification form, it's called, and we just call it the lead paint form oftentimes. And that on there has, the top of that says it's just dealing with lead paint, not everything else in the house. So it will say, you know, do you know if there's lead paint in this house? They say yes, no, or unknown. Will you, has there been any mitigation? Have you done anything? Have you had this, the lead paint removed? Yes. Do you have documentation for that? Yes. So all of those things will be on there. The agent signs it. Then the second part, when the buyer buys that house, he's given that form, and it will say, you know, you see the seller's responses, you do know that there's lead paint in here, blah, 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 blah. Go through all of that thing, sign it. There's a pull-off, which is a pamphlet on there that you give to the buyer that is going to be the information they need for lead paint. So that's a little bit different than the seller's disclosure form. The seller's disclosure form is usually something that encompasses the whole house, and that property transfer notification would be your lead paint form. I hope that answered your question, and I'm sorry that I didn't see that till we moved on to agency relationship or disclosure. But the agency disclosure, you give them at the first meeting to discuss a specific property, all right? And you will have another module on how to fill it out. It's in your showcase, but you are going to be saying, I'm a seller's agent, I'm a buyer's agent, I'm a facilitator. The back of that form has an explanation. Don't just give it to them and say, oh, this explains everything that you need to know about agency disclosure. Go over it with them, especially if they're new to this process, so that you know, you make sure that they understand what that agency disclosure form is. So that's pretty much the mandatory form in Massachusetts. And guess what? As always, we're here for you. I'm going to go back to full screen so I can see you guys. Hi, so I can see the chat a little bit better. So there you go. So I hope you enjoyed. I'm sorry about the little snafu in the beginning. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you guys want to, it's pretty interesting. If you go, you don't need to be a member to go look at the information that the National Association of Realtors is putting out there. There, you can go to the association, NAR, I think it's nar.org, but just type in your browser, National Association of Realtors Fair Housing, and you will see that video. They have a couple of other videos. They have a whole breakdown because, as I said, we're celebrating the 50 years of the fair housing. And so they have some really good information there. And I suggest that you take a look at it just because it's, you know, I think it's very well done. They show resources for the consumer, resources for you. There's some things that you might not be able to get into because you're not realtors yet, but you will be able to see that video and a lot of other information they have for fair housing. So this has been great. Hope you all had a great time. I'm seeing if I can chat here. I don't know why. I see your chat, but I don't know why I can't chat. And that's about it. Is everybody good? Anybody need anything? No, my chat completely went away. So my chat completely went away. So I'm just going to say goodbye to you guys for right now. Thanks for hanging out with me. And I will be back Thursday evening, and I'll let you know. We'll let you guys know as far as through email and through our source site which modules are coming up. I hope you had a good day. Bye-bye.